My name is Frances. I am 58 years old, and I spent 40 years building what I thought was a perfect life. A beautiful home, a successful husband, a loving daughter. Every morning, I'd wake up next to Richard believing I knew every part of him. We had routines, shared dreams, inside jokes that only we understood, until one ordinary Tuesday afternoon shattered everything I believed about the man sleeping beside me for all those years. If you've ever trusted someone with your entire heart, you'll understand what comes next. Before I tell you how I discovered his double life, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Because what I found and what I did about it changed everything. I retired from teaching elementary school 3 years ago after 35 years of shaping young minds. That was my contribution, my career, my purpose. I met Richard when I was barely 20 years old at a little coffee shop in Portland, Oregon. He was 24, charming with these ambitious eyes that made you believe he could build anything. And he did. We married 2 years after that first conversation over lukewarm coffee and burnt toast. Our daughter Laura came along 5 years later. She's 35 now, living up in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids. A good life. Richard built his construction engineering company from nothing, and I watched it grow while I raised Laura, kept our home-planted rose gardens, and waited for him to come back from job sites. We traveled every year, Italy 3 times. We were planning France for next summer. Richard traveled for work constantly. 2, sometimes 3 days a week, he'd be at construction sites across Oregon and Washington. I got used to sleeping alone half the week, used to eating dinner by myself, used to his tired face when he came home, the way he'd collapse on the couch and tell me about difficult clients and demanding projects. I believed every word. This past March, small things started shifting. Nothing dramatic, just tiny alterations in a 40-year pattern. Richard began placing his phone face down on tables. Before he'd leave it anywhere unlocked, unconcerned. Now it was always screened down, always within reach. He'd get calls and step outside to answer them. When I asked, he'd say it was a particularly demanding client. Some big commercial project with endless complications. I wanted to believe him. When you've trusted someone for 4 decades, you don't suddenly start questioning their every move. That feels like betrayal itself. One evening in late March, Richard left his phone on the kitchen counter while he showered. It buzzed. The screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize. Dr. Martinez appointment reminder. I stared at it, my heart doing this odd little flutter. Why didn't I know Richard had a doctor's appointment? We told each other everything, didn't we? When he came out of the bathroom, hair still damp, I asked him about it. Casual light, like I was just making conversation. He didn't even pause. Said it was just a routine checkup, nothing to worry about. He'd scheduled it months ago and forgot to mention it. His voice was so natural, so effortlessly normal, that I felt foolish for even wondering. But that little seed of doubt had been planted. The following week, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket while gathering laundry. Flowers. $137 worth of flowers from an upscale florist downtown. He hadn't brought me flowers? I looked at the date. 3 days ago. Thursday. He'd been home Thursday evening, walked through the door empty-handed except for his briefcase. I held that receipt in my hand for a long time, standing there in our laundry room, surrounded by the smell of detergent and fabric softener. Then I walked into the kitchen where Richard was reading the newspaper and asked him about it. Kept my voice light, curious, not accusatory. He looked up completely relaxed. Said he'd bought them for his office secretary, Angela. She was retiring after 20 years, and he wanted to do something nice. It made perfect sense. Richard was thoughtful like that. Always had been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like trying to ignore a stone in your shoe. You can walk on it for a while, but eventually it starts to hurt. My best friend Patricia, who I'd been taking yoga classes with for the past 5 years, noticed my distraction. Over green tea after class one afternoon, she asked if everything was okay. I told her about the phone, the flowers, the vague feeling that Richard was somehow distant. She got very quiet, then reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She said sometimes our instincts know things before our minds catch up. She suggested I pay attention, stay alert. That night, Richard came home with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. He wrapped his arms around me in the kitchen, pulled me close, and whispered that he loved me. I melted into him, feeling guilty for doubting this man who'd been my partner for 40 years. I told myself I was being paranoid, letting my imagination run wild over nothing. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The real unraveling began the following Tuesday. I was organizing Richard's closet, something I did twice a year, sorting through old jackets he never wore anymore. In the inner pocket of a navy blazer he hadn't touched in months, I found a canceled check. Just a slip of paper, really. But it changed everything. The check was made out to East Side Property Management for $2,000, dated 6 weeks ago. I stared at the name, trying to place it. We didn't own any property on the east side of the city. Our home was west in the suburbs. We had the cabin up in the mountains, but that was north. East Side meant nothing to me. I went to my laptop and searched for East Side Property Management. It was a real company, legitimate, with an office about 30 miles east of our home. They managed apartment complexes and rental properties. Why would Richard be paying them? My hands were shaking as I logged into our joint bank account. We'd always shared everything financially. Complete transparency. Or so I thought. I scrolled through 6 months of statements, something I rarely did because Richard handled most of our finances. He was better with numbers, more interested in investment strategies and budget planning. I'd always been content to let him manage it. That's when I saw the pattern. Every single month, like clockwork, a transfer of $5,000 from our joint account to another account. The receiving account number was partially visible. I didn't recognize it. This had been happening for months. I went back further. 6 months of transfers. $30,000 moved systematically to an account I knew nothing about. My chest felt tight. I printed out the statements with trembling fingers, the printer's mechanical whir sounding unnaturally loud in our quiet house. That evening, while Richard was at the table finishing his dinner, I brought up East Side Property Management. I tried to sound casual, but my voice came out strained. I asked him what it was, why we were paying them. He looked up sharply, and for just a second, I saw something flash across his face. Surprise, fear. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual calm demeanor. He set down his fork and explained that it was a small investment property he'd bought with a business partner. Just a rental unit, nothing major. He hadn't wanted to bother me with the details since it was more of a business venture than a personal asset. I asked why he hadn't discussed a $2,000 investment with me. We'd always made financial decisions together. He reached across the table, covered my hand with his, and apologized. Said he should have told me that it was only $2,000 and didn't seem significant enough to worry me with. He promised to be more transparent going forward. Then he stood up, came around to my side, kissed my forehead, and asked if I wanted to watch a movie together. I said yes. We watched some comedy I couldn't focus on. Richard laughed at all the right moments, his arm around my shoulders like always. But I couldn't stop thinking about those bank transfers. I didn't sleep at all that night. At 3 a.m, I got up and went back to the laptop. Richard was snoring softly in our bedroom. I sat in the dark kitchen, the laptop screen casting blue light across my face, and looked at every transaction for the past year. The transfers had started 9 months ago. $5,000 every month like clockwork. $55,000 total moved to an account I didn't have access to. I wrote down the dates, the amounts, everything. The next morning, after Richard left for work, I called Laura. My voice broke when she answered. I told her everything. The phone calls, the flowers, the check, the transfers. Laura was silent for a long moment, then asked what I wanted to do. I didn't know. Part of me wanted to confront Richard directly, demand answers. But another part, the part that had been married for 40 years, was terrified of what those answers might be. Laura said I needed to find out the truth before doing anything else. She suggested hiring a private investigator, but that felt too extreme, too much like admitting my marriage was a lie. She promised to drive down from Seattle that weekend to be with me. Her voice was steady strong, and I clung to it like a lifeline. After we hung up, I sat in the empty house and cried. Wednesday morning, Richard left for a 2-day work trip. He kissed me goodbye at the door, told me he'd call that evening, and drove away in his truck. I watched him disappear down the street. Then I got in my car and drove 30 miles east. The drive felt surreal. Morning traffic, coffee shops, people going about their normal lives, while mine was potentially crumbling. I found Eastside Property Management in a modest office building near a shopping complex. The parking lot was half full. I sat in my car for 10 minutes gathering courage, then walked inside. The reception area was small and professional. A young woman, maybe mid-20s, sat behind a desk with a nameplate that read Ashley. She looked up with a bright smile and asked how she could help me. I said I was interested in renting an apartment in the area. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too high, too forced. Ashley pulled up a list on her computer and started going through available units. I nodded, pretending to listen, then casually mentioned that a friend had recommended this company. His name was Richard. Did she know if he was a client here? Ashley's fingers flew across the keyboard. She said yes. Actually, they had a Mr. Richard who'd been renting a unit for about 3 years now. Was that who I meant? 3 years? The room tilted slightly. I gripped the edge of her desk and asked if she could tell me which property. She gave me the address, Maple Ridge Apartments, about 3 miles east, Unit 2B. I thanked her, said I'd think about it, and walked back to my car on legs that didn't feel like my own. 3 years, not 9 months. 3 entire years of this secret. I drove to Maple Ridge Apartments in a daze. It was a nice complex, 3 stories, well-maintained with tidy landscaping. I parked far from the building in a spot where I could see the entrance to the second floor. Unit 2B had a small balcony with flower pots. I sat there all afternoon. Brought a bottle of water I couldn't drink. Watched people come and go. At 3:15, a woman emerged from Unit 2B. She was younger than me, mid-30s, I guessed. Long brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, slim build, wearing jeans and a casual sweater. But what made my heart stop completely were the 2 children with her. A boy maybe 8 years old, a little girl, perhaps 5. The woman held the girl's hand while the boy walked ahead, backpack bouncing. They got into a silver minivan, parked directly below the apartment. I watched them drive away, probably heading to pick up from school. I took pictures with my phone, my hands shaking so badly the first few were blurred. They came back an hour later. The kids were laughing about something, the boy chasing his little sister up the stairs, while the woman followed carrying grocery bags. They looked like a family, a normal, happy family. I sat in my car until the sun started setting, until the streetlights flickered on, until I couldn't feel my legs anymore. Then I drove home. Richard called that evening from his hotel, asked about my day, told me about the construction site he was inspecting. His voice was warm, familiar, the same voice that had said good morning to me for 40 years. I told him I'd spent the day gardening. He said that was nice. We talked for 5 more minutes about nothing, then said goodnight and I love you like we had thousands of times before. I hung up and threw up in the bathroom sink. Laura arrived Friday evening. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug. I'd lost 6 pounds that week. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely think straight. She made me sit down while she heated up soup I couldn't taste. I showed her everything, the bank statements, the address, the photos of the woman and children. Laura's face went white, then red with anger. She wanted to drive over there immediately, wanted to confront whoever that woman was, wanted to call our father and scream at him. I stopped her, told her we needed to be smart about this. Emotional reactions wouldn't protect me legally or financially. We needed facts, documentation, a strategy. Laura took a deep breath and agreed. She pulled out her laptop and started searching for divorce attorneys in Portland. We spent 2 hours reading reviews, looking at case histories, checking credentials. Finally, we found Margaret Stone, a lawyer who specialized in complex divorce cases, particularly those involving hidden assets and infidelity. Laura called first thing Monday morning and made an appointment for that afternoon. Margaret Stone's office was downtown on the 14th floor of a glass building with a view of the city. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing a navy suit that meant business. She shook our hands firmly and invited us to sit. I told her everything. My voice broke several times, but I got through it. I showed her the photographs, the bank statements, the canceled check. When I finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment, reviewing the documents I'd spread across her desk. Then she looked up and said this was potentially a case of bigamy if Richard had married this other woman. But even if he hadn't, it was clear infidelity with significant financial implications. She explained that Oregon was a community property state. Everything acquired during our marriage belonged equally to both of us. But the fact that Richard had been systematically transferring marital funds to support another household meant I had grounds to request more than half in a divorce settlement. Margaret outlined a strategy. First, hire a private investigator to gather concrete evidence. Second, conduct a complete forensic accounting of all our assets. Third, file for a court order to freeze all accounts and assets before Richard could move anything else. Fourth, only then would we confront him and serve divorce papers. She quoted me a retainer of $15,000. I had that much in my personal savings account money I'd accumulated from my teaching salary over the years. Money Richard didn't control. I wrote the check right there. Margaret called a private investigator she worked with regularly, a man named Jack Morrison. He arrived at her office within an hour. Ex-police detective, calm demeanor, kind eyes. He listened to everything, took notes, and said he'd start immediately. 1 week later, Jack called me to Margaret's office for a briefing. Laura drove down again to be with me. We sat across from Jack as he opened a file folder and began laying out what he'd discovered. The woman's name was Amanda Brooks, 35 years old. The children were Connor, 8, and Lily, 5. Richard was listed as the father on both birth certificates. He'd been with Amanda for 9 years. 9 years of a completely separate life. Jack had documentation of everything. Richard rented the apartment for Amanda. He paid for her car. He sent her $4,000 every month from an account I'd never known about. In total, over 9 years, Richard had transferred approximately $432,000 of our money to support this second family. $432,000. I couldn't breathe. Laura's hand found mine and held on tight. Margaret slid a box of tissues across her desk. I took one, then another, then gave up and just let the tears fall. 9 years ago. I thought back. Laura had just announced her first pregnancy. We'd been so excited preparing to become grandparents. Richard had said work was getting busier, that he'd need to travel more for bigger contracts. I'd been understanding, supportive, proud of his success. He'd been starting a second life. While I celebrated our coming grandchild, he was celebrating the birth of his secret son. The betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was about every lie, every moment of trust I'd given him while he lived this elaborate deception. It was about the stolen money, the stolen time, the stolen truth. Something inside me hardened that day. The grief turned into something else, something cold and determined. I looked up at Margaret and asked what my options were. She smiled, and it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knew how to fight and win. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret brought in a forensic accountant named David Turner. David was methodical, thorough, and found every hidden corner of Richard's financial life. He traced 3 bank accounts, 2 I'd known about and 1 I hadn't. He found investment portfolios I'd never seen statements for. He uncovered the full extent of our assets. David laid it all out in a comprehensive report. Our house fully paid off, worth $800,000. Richard's construction company valued at approximately $1,200,000. Investment accounts and stocks totaling $500,000. Retirement funds worth $700,000. The mountain cabin, another $200,000. 2 vehicles, savings accounts, Total marital assets approximately $4,500,000. Everything we'd built over 40 years of marriage. Everything I'd sacrificed my career for, thinking I was building our future together. And Richard had been siphoning it away to fund a secret life. David also discovered something else. 3 months ago, Richard had transferred $50,000 from our joint investment account into a new personal account, one opened in only his name. He was preparing something, possibly planning to leave me, or maybe planning to hide even more assets before I discovered the truth. Margaret filed an emergency motion for a freeze order on all our assets. She argued that Richard was systematically moving marital property and posed a flight risk for asset dissipation. The judge reviewed the evidence, including the bank statements showing the transfers and the new personal account, and granted the order. Every account Richard had access to was frozen. He couldn't sell anything, couldn't transfer any money, couldn't touch the house or the cabin or the business assets. Everything was locked down until the divorce was finalized. Margaret prepared the divorce filing, adultery as grounds, requesting 65 to 70% of all marital assets due to Richard's misappropriation of community property, demanding he pay all legal fees, requesting $100,000 in compensatory damages for emotional distress and breach of marital duty. We set a date to serve him. Friday evening, when he returned from his latest work trip. Margaret and Jack would be there as witnesses. Laura would be there for support. We'd do it at my home, my territory where I felt strongest. I spent Thursday night rehearsing what I'd say, practiced keeping my voice steady, my hands from shaking. I wanted to be strong, not broken. I wanted him to see that he hadn't destroyed me, that I was fighting back. Friday afternoon, I felt strangely calm. Margaret and Jack arrived at 4. Laura was already there, had been with me all day. We sat in the living room waiting. At 5:30, I heard Richard's truck in the driveway. He walked in smiling, carrying his work bag, called out a greeting, came into the living room, and stopped dead when he saw everyone sitting there. His smile faded. He looked confused, then concerned, asked what was going on, if everything was okay. I stood up, walked over to the coffee table where I'd placed a manila envelope, picked it up and handed it to him. Inside were photographs. Amanda leaving the apartment, Connor and Lily getting into the minivan, the apartment building at Maple Ridge, bank statements with the transfers highlighted, birth certificates with Richard's name as father. Richard opened the envelope, pulled out the first photograph. His face went completely white. He looked up at me, mouth opening, closing, no words coming out. I waited, let him look through everything, watched his face as the reality sank in that I knew everything. Finally, he tried to speak, said it wasn't what it looked like, that I didn't understand, that he could explain. I held up my hand, stopping him. I told him I didn't want to hear explanations or excuses. I knew exactly what it was. 9 years of lies, 9 years of betrayal, $432,000 of our money spent on another family. Richard's face crumpled. He actually got down on his knees in front of me, started crying, saying he was sorry that he loved me, that Amanda was a mistake, that it all got out of control. He said he never meant to hurt me, that he'd tried to end it so many times, but there were children involved, and he couldn't abandon them. I looked down at this man I'd shared 40 years with, kneeling on our living room floor crying, and I felt nothing. No sympathy, no softness, no desire to comfort him like I'd done countless times over 4 decades. I asked him if he thought I was stupid, if he thought I'd just accept this, if he expected me to understand and forgive because it was complicated for him. He reached for my hand. I stepped back. Laura appeared in the doorway. She looked at her father with such disgust that he flinched. She said she couldn't believe he'd done this, that he'd destroyed everything, that she didn't want to see him or speak to him, that as far as she was concerned, he wasn't her father anymore. Richard tried to stand, tried to approach Laura, but she held up her hand exactly like I had and told him not to come near her. Margaret Stone stood up then. She walked over and handed Richard a second envelope. The divorce papers. He took them with shaking hands. Margaret explained calmly and professionally that all our assets had been frozen by court order, that I was filing for divorce on grounds of adultery, that I was requesting 65 to 70% of all marital property, plus damages, plus legal fees, that he had 30 days to respond through his own attorney. Richard stared at the papers. He said this wasn't fair, that he'd built the business, that he'd been the primary earner. My voice when I finally spoke was ice cold. I told him I'd given up my career to raise our daughter, to manage our home, to support his business by handling everything else so he could focus on work. That without me, he wouldn't have been able to build anything. That I'd earned every penny of what we had by being his partner for 40 years. I told him that according to Oregon law, everything was community property anyway, and the fact that he'd stolen from our community to build another one meant he owed me far more than half. Margaret added that if Richard wanted to fight this in court, she'd be happy to make everything public. The second family, the financial deception, all of it. It would be great for his business reputation. Richard looked defeated. He asked if he could have time to think. Margaret said he had 30 days to respond to the filing, but the asset freeze remained in effect regardless. Then I told him to leave, to pack a bag and get out of my house. He said this was his house too. I said not anymore. He could go stay with his other family, the one he'd been supporting with my money. Richard stood there for another moment, looking between me and Laura and Margaret, like he hoped someone would soften, would give him an opening. Nobody did. He went upstairs. We heard him moving around, opening drawers, closing them. He came back down 20 minutes later with a suitcase. He stopped at the door and turned back. He said I was still the woman he loved most. I told him that if that were true, he never would have done this. I told him to leave and not come back. He walked out. I closed the door behind him and locked it. Then I walked to the couch and sat down. Laura sat beside me, put her arms around me. Margaret and Jack quietly gathered their things and left, saying they'd be in touch. For the first time in 3 weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Richard didn't fight the divorce. 2 months after I served him the papers, his attorney contacted Margaret with a settlement offer. He'd agreed to 65% for me, 35% for him. I'd get the house, the cabin, one vehicle, and my full retirement fund. We'd sell his share of the business back to him at an agreed-upon valuation, and he'd pay that amount in installments. He'd also pay $50,000 in damages and cover all legal fees. It was everything Margaret had asked for. Richard's attorney made it clear that Richard didn't want this going to trial, didn't want it becoming public. The scandal would destroy his business reputation and his relationships with clients. Margaret asked if I wanted to push for more. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to take him for everything, wanted to leave him with nothing the way he'd almost left me, with nothing but lies. But I was tired. I wanted it over. I wanted to move forward with my life. So I agreed to the settlement. 3 months after that Friday evening confrontation, the divorce was finalized. 40 years of marriage dissolved in a legal document signed by a judge I'd never met. I sold the house within a month. I couldn't live there anymore. Every room held memories that now felt tainted. The kitchen where we'd had coffee together every morning. The bedroom where I'd slept beside him never knowing. The garden where I'd planted roses thinking we'd grow old together, watching them bloom year after year. I bought a smaller condo in Seattle close to Laura and the grandkids. Something fresh with no history, no ghosts. I started filling my days with things I'd always wanted to do, but never had time for. I enrolled in a painting class at the community center. I'd loved art as a young woman, but set it aside when teaching and motherhood took over. Now I had time. I had space to rediscover that part of myself. In the painting class, I met Helen, a 70-year-old widow with silver hair and a wicked sense of humor. She'd lost her husband 5 years ago to cancer and had been rebuilding her life piece by piece. We became friends quickly, bonding over coffee after class, sharing stories about our lives. Helen had always wanted to go to Paris. So had I. Richard and I had talked about it for years, but never gone. So Helen and I booked tickets. Two widows, one literal and one figurative, spending 3 weeks in France visiting museums and cafes and gardens. It was the best trip of my life. I discovered something important during those months. I could be happy alone. Not lonely, but genuinely content in my own company. I didn't need a partner to feel complete. I'd spent 40 years defining myself through my marriage, through being Richard's wife. Now I was just Frances, and Frances was enough. I still had hard days. Days when I'd see an older couple holding hands and feel the loss like a physical ache. Days when something funny would happen and I'd instinctively reach for my phone to call Richard before remembering. Days when I questioned everything, wondered how I'd missed the signs for so long, felt foolish and blind. But those days became less frequent. And on the good days, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Richard at a coffee shop downtown. I'd driven back to Portland to visit Patricia, and we'd stopped for lattes. Richard was there sitting alone at a corner table. We made eye contact. For a second, I thought about leaving. But then I realized I didn't need to run. I wasn't afraid anymore. He stood up as I approached, asked if we could talk for a minute. I agreed. Patricia took our coffees to a different table, giving us space. Richard looked older, tired. There were new lines around his eyes, gray in his hair that hadn't been there a year ago. He asked how I was doing. I said I was doing well. I told him about the condo, about painting, about Paris. I didn't ask how he was, but he told me anyway. He was trying to balance everything: the business, Amanda, and the kids. Amanda knew about me now, about the whole situation. She wasn't happy, but was trying to accept it. Connor had some questions about why Dad hadn't mentioned having another family. It was complicated. Richard said he regretted everything, that he'd made terrible choices and hurt everyone he cared about. He said he wished he could go back and do things differently. I believed him. I could see the regret, the pain, the weight of his choices bearing down on him. And I realized I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't feel anything toward him at all, really. He was just a man I used to know. Someone who'd once been important but wasn't anymore. I told him I hoped he figured things out. Then I stood up, said goodbye, and went back to Patricia. We left a few minutes later. As we walked to the car, Patricia asked if I was okay. I thought about it, really thought about it, and I realized I was. I was genuinely okay. I'd survived the worst betrayal imaginable. I'd fought back instead of crumbling. I'd protected myself financially and legally. I'd built a new life from the ashes of the old one. I was okay, more than okay. I discovered something important through all of this. Pain is inevitable in life. We can't control what other people do to us, but we can absolutely control how we respond. We can choose to be victims, or we can choose to be survivors who fight back. I chose to fight. I chose myself. And that choice saved my life. People sometimes ask me if I think about what might have been if I'd stayed, if I'd forgiven him, if I'd tried to make it work. And the answer is no. I don't think about that at all. Because the moment I discovered his betrayal, the marriage was already over. He'd killed it himself slowly over 9 years of lies. I just made it official. The fortune I took wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was taking back what I'd earned through 40 years of partnership, of sacrifice, of trust. It was ensuring that my future would be secure, that I wouldn't be left with nothing after giving everything. And honestly, the fortune wasn't just the money. It was my freedom, my self-respect, my ability to look in the mirror and see someone strong instead of someone broken. That's what I truly took from the wreckage of my marriage. My dignity, my future, myself. Richard thought I'd be too devastated to fight back. He thought 40 years of depending on him meant I couldn't stand on my own. He thought wrong. After 40 years of choosing him, choosing us, choosing our marriage, I finally chose me, and that decision gave me back my life. Sometimes people ask me if I ever think about what could have been if I had stayed, if I had forgiven him. And I always smile and say, I chose myself. After 40 years of choosing him, I finally chose me, and that decision gave me back my life. The fortune I took was not just money. It was my freedom, my dignity, and my future. And no one can ever take that away from me again. So let me ask you, have you ever had to make an impossible choice that changed your life? Have you ever had to choose yourself when it felt like the hardest thing in the world? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if this resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone who might need to hear it, someone who needs to know that it's never too late to fight for yourself. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the courage to always choose yourself when it matters most. Take care of yourself out there.